The unexpected proposal. Jake was alone in the quiet of his lab, working on his latest research. As a scientist stationed on Zorith, a distant alien planet, his life was usually predictable. Just him, his equipment, and the occasional alien wildlife wandering by. But tonight was different. There was a strange tension in the air, a hum he couldn't quite place. He brushed it off as planetary activity until he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Jake turned sharply, his heart racing. Standing in the doorway was an alien girl, unlike any he'd seen before. She was tall and graceful, her pale blue skin shimmering faintly under the lab's fluorescent lights. Her silver eyes were intense, and she was dressed in flowing robes adorned with intricate golden symbols. "Human," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We must marry." Jake blinked. For a moment, he wondered if he was hallucinating from too much caffeine. "Excuse me," he managed, his voice cracking slightly. "You heard me," she replied, stepping closer. Her movements were fluid, almost otherworldly. "Time is running out. You must marry me." Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Is this some kind of prank? Who sent you? Did someone hack my communication system?" She sighed, her expression a mix of frustration and desperation. "There's no time to explain everything. My name is Lyra, and I am the daughter of the High Chancellor of Zorith. My people are on the brink of war. If we do not form a bond, everything will collapse." "Why me?" Jake asked, taking a cautious step back. "I'm just a scientist. I don't even know you." Lyra's silver eyes softened for a moment. "Because you are human. Your people are seen as impartial and unaligned. The Council will respect a union between us. If we don't act now, factions within my society will descend into chaos." Jake stared at her, struggling to process what she was saying. It sounded like something out of one of the sci-fi novels he used to read as a kid. "You're telling me that marrying you will stop a war?" "Yes," she said firmly. "But we have to leave now. They're coming for me." As if on cue, an alarm blared outside the lab, and the ground trembled slightly. Jake looked out the window and saw a group of armored alien guards approaching, their weapons glowing ominously in the night. His instincts screamed at him to run, but Lyra grabbed his arm. "Jake, listen to me," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If they capture me, it's over. You're my only chance." He looked into her eyes and saw something he didn't expect. Fear, not just for herself but for her people, maybe even for him. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "Fine. But if this is a trick..." "It's not," she interrupted, a small smile of relief crossing her face. "Thank you." Before Jake could say another word, Lyra pulled out a small device and pressed a button. A shimmering portal appeared in the middle of the lab, swirling with hues of blue and green. Jake's jaw dropped. "What the..." "No time for questions," Lyra said, pulling him toward the portal. "We need to reach the sacred site before they catch us." Jake hesitated for a split second, but the sound of the guards breaking into the lab made the decision for him. He grabbed his research tablet, more out of habit than necessity, and followed Lyra into the unknown. The sensation of traveling through the portal was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. It was as if he were weightless, floating through a kaleidoscope of colors and light. When they emerged on the other side, he stumbled slightly, his legs shaky. They were in a vast forest, the trees towering like skyscrapers and glowing faintly in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of strange flowers, and the distant sound of alien creatures echoed through the trees. Lyra didn't waste a moment. "This way," she said, leading him down a narrow path. Jake followed, his mind racing. He had so many questions, but the urgency in her tone kept him quiet. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they arrived at a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone structure, covered in glowing symbols similar to the ones on Lyra's robes. She stopped and turned to face him. "This is the sacred site," she said. "Once the ritual is complete, the Council will recognize our bond. It's the only way to ensure peace. Jake frowned. Ritual. Bond. You're throwing a lot at me here. What exactly does this marriage entail? Lyra hesitated, her confident demeanor faltering for the first time. It's more than a union. It's a promise, an eternal bond that connects our souls. It's not something to take lightly, but it's our only hope. Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the forest. Lyra's expression turned grim. They'd found us. Jake, I need you to trust me. He glanced at the temple, the glowing symbols, and the determined alien girl standing before him. Every instinct told him to run, but something about Lyra, her bravery, her desperation, kept him rooted in place. Fine, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Let's do this. Lyra nodded, a spark of gratitude in her eyes. Together, they stepped into the temple as the shadows of their pursuers loomed closer. Escaping the pursuers, the ancient portal shimmered behind them, collapsing with a crackling hiss as Jake stumbled onto the mossy ground of an alien forest. Towering trees with bioluminescent leaves bathed the area in a soft, shifting glow. The air was heavy and sweet, filled with the distant hum of alien insects. Jake barely had time to catch his breath before Lyra yanked him forward. They won't be far behind, she said, her voice sharp but steady. She held a small device in her hand that emitted a faint pulse of blue light. This way. Jake followed her, his heart pounding as much from confusion as fear. He had never been much of an adventurer. He preferred his safe, controlled lab. But here he was, running through an alien jungle with a girl who had just told him they needed to get married to save her people. He glanced back, catching a flicker of light in the distance. Of Lyra. I think we've got company. They're faster than I thought, Lyra muttered under her breath, her silver eyes scanning the dense forest. We need to slow them down. Jake stopped in his tracks. Slow them down? How exactly do you propose we do that? You've got alien soldiers with glowing weapons back there, and I've got a tablet and zero survival training. Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. You have more than you think, human. Trust me. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, she pressed the glowing device into his hand. Hold this. What is it? Jake asked, inspecting the alien gadget. A signal scrambler, she said, crouching to pull out a small orb from her robes. It'll disrupt their tracking systems, if you can activate it. Jake frowned. I don't even know how this thing works. Think of it as a puzzle, Lyra said, her tone oddly calm despite the urgency. You're a scientist, aren't you? Solve it. Jake stared at the device. It had no buttons, no screens, just a smooth metallic surface that pulsed faintly under his touch. He turned it over, noticing small grooves etched into the surface. As he studied it, the light in the grooves shifted, forming patterns that reminded him of constellations. Behind them, the faint hum of approaching soldiers grew louder. Jake's fingers worked instinctively, sliding the grooves into alignment. The device clicked, and a soft hum vibrated through his hand. Got it, he said, holding it up triumphantly. Lyra smiled faintly. Not bad for a human. The device emitted a low-frequency pulse, and the air around them shimmered. Jake could feel the vibrations in his chest. What did that do? It should scramble their trackers for a few minutes, Lyra said, grabbing his arm. But it won't stop them entirely. Come on. They ran deeper into the forest, the terrain growing more treacherous. Vines and roots tangled around Jake's boots, and strange creatures darted through the underbrush. Every sound made him jump, but Lyra moved with purpose, as if she had walked this path 1,000 times. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a narrow ravine. A rope bridge stretched across it, swaying precariously in the wind. Jake's stomach dropped at the sight. You've got to be kidding me, he said. That thing doesn't look stable. It's our only option, Lyra said, already stepping onto the bridge. She moved quickly, her balance flawless despite the swaying. Jake hesitated, glancing back. The distant glow of their pursuers was growing brighter. He swallowed hard and stepped onto the bridge. The wood creaked under his weight, and the ropes groaned as the wind picked up. "Don't look down," Lyra called from the other side. "Great advice," Jake muttered, gripping the ropes tightly. He forced himself to focus on Lyra, who was already beckoning him to hurry. Halfway across, the sound of blaster fire erupted behind him. Jake froze as a burst of energy slammed into the side of the ravine, sending a shower of rocks tumbling into the abyss below. "They're here," he shouted. "Keep moving," Lyra yelled, drawing a sleek weapon from her belt. She aimed it at the approaching soldiers and fired, her shots precise and unrelenting. Jake scrambled forward, his heart racing. The bridge swayed violently as another blast hit, and for a terrifying moment, he thought it would collapse. But somehow he made it to the other side, collapsing onto the ground in a heap. Lyra grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "We need to keep moving." Jake nodded, still catching his breath. You're insane, you know that." Lyra smirked, her confidence returning. "You'll thank me later." As they disappeared into the forest, Jake couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. This was no ordinary adventure. It was a race against time, and for reasons he didn't fully understand, he was now a part of it. But one thing was clear. Lyra wasn't just running to save herself. She was fighting for something much bigger, and whether he liked it or not, Jake was now in the middle of it all. The sacred bond. The temple loomed before them, ancient and imposing, its surface covered in glowing alien glyphs that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Jake's racing heartbeat. The air around the structure hummed with energy, and a faint mist clung to the ground, giving the place an otherworldly aura. Jake hesitated at the base of the stone steps, staring up at the massive doors carved with intricate designs that depicted alien figures in ritualistic poses. "This is it?" Jake asked, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "This is where we get married." Lyra turned to him, her silver eyes reflecting the temple's eerie glow. "This is the sacred site. The bond must be formed here, or it won't be recognized by the council." Jake shook his head, running a hand through his messy hair. "I still don't understand what this bond even is. You're asking me to just go along with." "Jake," Lyra interrupted, her tone softer now. "I know this is overwhelming for you, but you have to trust me. If we don't do this, my people will tear themselves apart. The bond is the only way to unite them." He looked at her, his skepticism warring with the sincerity in her expression. She wasn't just desperate, she was genuinely afraid. For her people, for herself, maybe even for him. Against his better judgment, he sighed. "All right, let's get this over with." Lyra nodded and pressed her hand against the temple door. The glyphs flared to life, and the massive stone doors groaned open, revealing a dark chamber filled with swirling light. Jake hesitated, but Lyra grabbed his hand and led him inside. The interior was even more stunning than the exterior. Pillars of glowing crystal stretched to the ceiling, casting prismatic light across the chamber. At the center was a raised platform with a circular engraving that pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. Surrounding the platform were floating orbs of light that shifted and swirled, creating a soft melody that seemed to resonate in Jake's chest. "This is the altar," Lyra said, leading him toward the platform. "Once we step onto it, the ritual will begin." Jake frowned. "And what exactly happens during this ritual? You keep talking about a bond, but what does that mean?" Lyra hesitated, her confident demeanor faltering for the first time. "The bond is more than just a ceremony. It's a merging of our essences, a connection that goes beyond physical or emotional ties. It's eternal. Once it's formed, it can't be broken." Jake's eyes widened. "Wait, what? Eternal? You're saying this is forever?" "Yes," Lyra said, her voice steady. "That's why I chose you, Jake. You're not like the others. You see beyond politics and power. You care about doing what's right." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of distant voices echoed through the chamber. The guards had found them. "Jake, we don't have time," Lyra said, pulling him onto the platform. The moment their feet touched the engraved circle, the glyphs on the floor lit up, and the floating orbs began to spin faster. A deep, resonant voice filled the chamber, speaking in a language Jake couldn't understand. The air around them crackled with energy, and a column of light enveloped them, rising from the platform to the ceiling. Jake felt a strange warmth spreading through his body, as if the light were seeping into his very being. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The bond is being formed," Lyra said, her own voice laced with both awe and determination. "You need to focus. Think about why you're doing this, about the peace we're trying to create." Jake closed his eyes, trying to steady his thoughts. He pictured Earth, his quiet lab, the faces of the people he loved. And then he thought about Lyra, standing before him with her unshakable resolve, risking everything for her people. Maybe, just maybe, he could do this. The light around them intensified, and Jake felt a strange pull in his chest, as if something deep within him was being drawn toward Lyra. He opened his eyes and saw that her form was glowing now, her silver eyes locked onto his. "Do you accept this bond, Jake?" she asked, her voice echoing in the chamber. Jake hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes." The light flared brighter than ever, and a surge of energy shot through him. For a brief moment, he felt as if he were floating, weightless and free. And then, just as suddenly, the light vanished, and the chamber was plunged into silence. Jake stumbled slightly, catching himself on Lyra's arm. He looked at her, expecting some sort of explanation, but before she could speak, the deep voice from before boomed again. "The bond is eternal. Betrayal will mean death." Jake froze, his blood running cold. "What does that mean?" Lyra looked away, her expression unreadable. "It means there's no turning back now." Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. The guards were here, and this time, there was no escaping them. "Come on," Lyra said, grabbing his hand. "We have to face them together." Jake followed her, his mind racing. He had just bonded himself to an alien girl in a ritual he barely understood, with stakes higher than anything he'd ever imagined. And now, as the guards stormed into the chamber, he realized that his new reality was only just beginning. The eternal husband. The moment they stepped out of the temple, Jake felt the weight of the bond settle on him like an invisible cloak. He couldn't explain it, but something had changed. The air seemed sharper, every sound more vivid. And then there was Lyra. Her presence felt closer, deeper, as if she were connected to his very thoughts. "You feel it, don't you?" Lyra asked, glancing at him as they moved through the glowing forest. Her voice was softer now, less commanding. Jake rubbed his chest absent-mindedly. "Feel what?" "Like someone plugged my brain into a live wire." "Yeah, I feel it." Lyra gave a faint smile, the first genuine one he'd seen. "That's the bond. It's more than just a ceremony. It's a merging of our essence. You'll get used to it." "Used to it," Jake muttered. "I didn't sign up to be an alien husband, and whatever this merging thing is." "You did," Lyra corrected, her tone sharp. "And it saved both our lives." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of rustling leaves cut him off. They both froze, their eyes darting toward the treetops. A shadow moved above them, silent and predatory. Jake's grip tightened on the strange staff Lyra had handed him earlier. "They're here," Lyra whispered. She stepped in front of Jake, her posture shifting from calm to battle-ready in an instant. "Stay behind me." Jake felt a twinge of indignation. "Hey, I'm not completely helpless, you know." Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she raised her hand, and the air around them shimmered faintly. Jake could feel it. Some kind of energy, like an invisible shield. The bond between them seemed to amplify the sensation, as if he could sense her thoughts. The shadow above them leaped, and suddenly a group of armored figures dropped from the trees, landing with precision. They were alien soldiers, clad in sleek black armor that gleamed under the bioluminescent light. Their weapons hummed menacingly as they pointed them at the pair. "Lyra of Zorith," one of the soldiers said, his voice distorted through his helmet. "You've violated council law. Surrender now, and your punishment will be lenient." Lyra stood her ground, her silver eyes blazing. "I've done nothing wrong. The bond is complete. Jake and I are united, as decreed by the sacred rites. You have no authority here." The soldier stepped forward, his weapon raised. "The council will decide your fate, not you." Jake felt a surge of anger that wasn't entirely his own. It came from Lyra, bleeding through the bond. Before he could stop himself, he stepped forward, his voice louder than he intended. "Back off. She's right. We're bonded now. You touch her, you deal with me." The soldiers turned their attention to Jake, their expressions unreadable behind their helmets. The lead soldier tilted his head slightly, as if considering Jake's words. A human defending an alien princess. How amusing. Jake clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't a fighter or a hero. But something about the bond, about Lyra, made him stand taller. Before the tension could break into violence, a new voice rang out, commanding and calm. "Enough." A tall figure emerged from the shadows, draped in robes that shimmered like molten silver. His face was angular, his skin a deep shade of blue, and his eyes glowed faintly. Jake recognized him instantly. This was no ordinary alien. This was one of the council elders. "Elder Vinar," Lyra said, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" The elder raised a hand, and the soldiers lowered their weapons. He stepped closer, his gaze shifting between Lyra and Jake. "You've defied tradition, Lyra. The council was not informed of your choice." "I had no choice," Lyra shot back. "The factions were preparing for war. The bond was the only way to unite them." Vinar's gaze lingered on Jake, his expression unreadable. "And this human, do you truly believe he is worthy of such a bond?" Jake bristled at the question but held his tongue. Lyra, however, stepped closer to him, her voice firm. "He is. Jake is more than worthy." Vinar studied them both for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well. The council will summon you both to explain your actions. Until then, your bond protects you, for now." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, the soldiers following without a word. The tension in the air dissipated, leaving Jake and Lyra alone in the glowing forest. Jake exhaled, his shoulders slumping. Well, that wasn't terrifying at all. Lyra glanced at him, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "You handled it well." "Handled it well," Jake echoed. "I just yelled at armed soldiers and an alien elder. How is this my life now?" Lyra smiled faintly. "Welcome to being my eternal husband." Jake groaned, but there was a strange warmth in her words, a sense of partnership he hadn't expected. As they continued their journey through the forest, Jake couldn't help but feel that his life, as chaotic as it had become, was now tied to something far greater than himself. And maybe, just maybe, he was okay with that. For now. The enemy revealed. The campfire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. Jake sat on a smooth rock, staring into the flames as his mind churned with unanswered questions. The bond with Lyra hummed faintly in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the choice he'd made. Every now and then, he caught glimpses of her emotions, flickers of tension, determination, and something he couldn't quite place. Lyra crouched across from him, sharpening a blade that glimmered with a strange blue sheen. Her focus was razor-sharp, and Jake couldn't help but wonder what she was preparing for. "All right," Jake said, breaking the silence. "You've dragged me through forests, forced me into a glowing temple, and made me your eternal husband. I think it's time you start explaining what's really going on." Lyra paused, her eyes lifting to meet his. "You're not ready to hear it." "Not ready," Jake scoffed. "I've been chased by alien soldiers, threatened by an elder, and now I got this connection thing buzzing in my head. I think I deserve to know the truth." Lyra sighed, setting the blade aside. "The bond we formed isn't just a marriage. It's a symbol of unity between our people, yes, but it's also something more, something ancient." Jake frowned. "Ancient? What do you mean?" Lyra hesitated, then gestured to the sky above them. "Do you see those stars? Those constellations?" Jake looked up. The alien sky was breathtaking, filled with swirling nebulae and unfamiliar patterns of light. "Yeah, what about them?" "Long ago, my people weren't just explorers. We were conquerors," Lyra said, her voice tinged with regret. "We expanded across the galaxy, taking what we wanted, enslaving entire species. But one race stood against us, a race older and more powerful than any we'd encountered. They called themselves the Karnath." Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What happened to them?" "They were wiped out," Lyra said flatly. "Or so we thought. The ancient texts say the Karnath created a failsafe, a weapon hidden in the bonds of their enemies, a weapon that could be activated if they ever returned." Jake's mind reeled. "And this bond we just formed, it's connected to that weapon, isn't it?" Lyra nodded. "Yes. When we bonded, we awakened something. I felt it the moment the light surrounded us in the temple. The Karnath aren't extinct. They're waking up. And they'll come for us, for you, because of the bond." Jake stared at her, his chest tightening. "You knew this could happen, and you still went through with it." "I had no choice," Lyra snapped, her composure cracking. "My people are on the brink of war. If I hadn't bonded with you, the factions would have torn each other apart. But now we have a chance to unite them against a greater threat." Jake stood, running a hand through his hair. "A chance? You mean you dragged me into an ancient war I didn't sign up for, and now we're both targets?" Lyra rose to her feet, her silver eyes blazing. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to put you in danger? This bond isn't just about us. It's about the survival of entire worlds. You're a part of this now, whether you like it or not." Before Jake could respond, the air around them shifted. A low, resonant hum filled the clearing, and the fire flickered wildly. Lyra's hand shot to her blade, and Jake felt a surge of unease through the bond. "They're here," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake followed her gaze, his heart pounding. Shadows moved at the edge of the clearing, their forms indistinct but menacing. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It was tall and skeletal, its body encased in black, organic armor that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Its eyes glowed red, and its voice was like a chorus of whispers. "Lyra of Zorith," the figure said, its gaze shifting to Jake. "And the human who bears the bond. How amusing." Jake swallowed hard, his palms sweating. Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, its movements unnervingly fluid. "I am Karnathus, the harbinger of my people. We have watched your kind for centuries, waiting for the moment the bond would awaken. And now it has." Lyra stepped in front of Jake, her blade gleaming in the firelight. "If you've come for the bond, you'll have to go through me." Karnathus chuckled, the sound chilling and hollow. "Oh, we will. But not tonight. Tonight, I merely came to see what sort of human would be foolish enough to tether themselves to a Zorethian." Jake bristled, his fear giving way to anger. "Foolish, huh? At least I'm not skulking around in the dark like some second-rate villain." Karnathus's glowing eyes narrowed. "Bold words, human. You may regret them soon enough." With that, the figure melted back into the shadows, and the hum in the air faded. Jake exhaled shakily, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. You didn't have to antagonize him. Sorry, Jake said, his voice shaky. It's kind of a reflex. Lyra's lips twitched into a faint smile. You're braver than you look, Jake. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, well, let's hope that's enough, because it sounds like things are about to get a whole lot worse. As the fire crackled softly, Jake realized the gravity of what lay ahead. He wasn't just an eternal husband. He was now a key player in a battle that could decide the fate of the galaxy. And for better or worse, there was no turning back. The final test. The air inside the heart of the planet was stifling, thick with energy that buzzed against Jake's skin. He stood on a narrow ledge overlooking a cavernous abyss, the walls of which pulsed with veins of glowing crystal. The light cast strange shadows, and the faint sound of humming filled the air, as if the cavern itself was alive. Across from him, Lyra stood with her blade in hand, her expression unreadable. This is it, Jake asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. This is the trial. Lyra nodded, her silver eyes locked onto his. This is where we prove our bond. If we succeed, the Council will have no choice but to accept us. And if we fail, Jake ventured, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Lyra's gaze didn't waver. We won't fail. Jake swallowed hard, unsure if her confidence reassured him or made him more nervous. All right. So what do we have to do? Fight something. Solve a puzzle. Cross that ridiculously unstable-looking bridge over there. Lyra's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. The trial isn't something you can plan for, Jake. It's different for everyone. The heart of the planet responds to your bond, your fears, your doubts. It will test us in ways we can't predict. Great, Jake muttered. So it's basically an alien therapy session from hell. Before Lyra could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled, and the ledge they were standing on began to shift. The glowing crystals flared brighter, and the air grew heavier. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the cavern, speaking in a language Jake didn't understand, but he could feel its meaning through the bond. Prove your unity. Face your truth. Only together can you succeed. Jake exchanged a glance with Lyra, but before either of them could speak, the ground beneath Jake's feet disappeared. He let out a startled cry as he fell, the glowing crystals blurring around him. Just as panic set in, he landed on a soft, moss-like surface, the impact knocking the wind out of him. When he sat up, he realized he was no longer in the cavern. He was in his old lab. The familiar sight of Earth technology surrounded him. Desks cluttered with equipment, blinking monitors, and the faint hum of machinery. For a moment, he thought he'd been transported home. But then he saw Lyra. She stood in the middle of the room, looking completely out of place amidst the human equipment. Her silver eyes scanned the space, and when they met Jake's, she frowned. "This is your test," she said quietly. "My test," Jake echoed, climbing to his feet. "What does my old lab have to do with anything?" Lyra stepped closer, her expression softening. "This place, it means something to you. It's where you felt safe, isn't it?" Jake opened his mouth to deny it, but the words caught in his throat. She was right. This lab had been his sanctuary, the place where he could focus on his work and shut out the chaos of the outside world. But seeing it now, he felt an unexpected pang of guilt. "I spent so much time here," Jake admitted, his voice low. "Too much time. I shut people out, family, friends, all because I thought my work was more important." Lyra tilted her head, studying him. "Why?" Jake hesitated, then sighed. "Because it was easier. If I focused on my work, I didn't have to deal with everything else. The mistakes I'd made, the people I'd hurt." The room seemed to respond to his words, the monitors flickering, and the hum growing louder. Lyra stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "You can't run from your past, Jake," she said gently. "The bond doesn't just connect us, it reveals who we truly are. If you want to move forward, You have to face it." Before Jake could respond, the room dissolved around them, and they were back in the cavern. But this time, the glowing crystals had shifted, forming a bridge that spanned the abyss. Jake glanced at Lyra, who gave him a small nod. "Your turn," he said, motioning for her to lead. Lyra hesitated, and for the first time, Jake saw uncertainty in her eyes. She stepped onto the bridge, the glow from the crystals illuminating her path. As she walked, the cavern began to change again, the walls shifting to display images, scenes from her life. Jake watched as the images played out. Lyra as a child, training with a blade, her face set with determination. Lyra standing before a council, arguing passionately while others sneered at her. And then, Lyra standing alone, her shoulders slumped as tears streamed down her face. "Lyra," Jake began, but she shook her head. "I was always alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even as a princess, I was never enough. I fought for my people, for peace, but no one believed in me. They called me naive, reckless." The bridge beneath her feet glowed brighter, and the images faded. Lyra turned to Jake, her expression fierce. "But I kept fighting, because I believed that one person could make a difference. And now I'm not alone anymore." Jake felt the bond hum between them, stronger than ever. He stepped onto the bridge, meeting her halfway. "You're not alone," he said firmly. "We'll face this together." The cavern rumbled, and the crystals around them blazed with light. The bridge solidified, and the voice from before echoed once more. "You have proven your unity. The bond is true." As the cavern settled, Jake and Lyra stood side by side, the weight of their journey still heavy but their resolve unshaken. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. For the first time, Jake truly believed in the power of their bond, and in himself. The eternal promise. The temple's inner sanctum was silent, save for the faint hum of energy that lingered in the air. Jake stood at the center of the ancient chamber, its walls inscribed with alien symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The bond between him and Lyra was stronger than ever, an invisible thread tying their fates together. But the weight of what they had endured hung heavy in the air. Lyra stood beside him, her silver eyes fixed on a crystalline artifact that hovered before them. It was the final piece of the trial, a relic said to embody the will of the Zorathian ancestors. The artifact pulsed faintly, as if waiting for their decision. "This is it," Lyra said, her voice steady but soft. "The council will know we've succeeded. They'll have no choice but to recognize our bond." Jake glanced at her, a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. They had fought soldiers, faced ancient enemies, and confronted their deepest fears to get here. And now, the fate of not just their bond but their worlds rested in their hands. "You're sure this will work?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Lyra nodded. "It has to. The ancestors' blessing will silence the dissenters, but once we activate it, there's no going back." Jake took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the artifact. It glowed brighter as he stepped closer, as if sensing his presence. "No pressure, right?" Before Lyra could respond, a deep, guttural laugh echoed through the chamber. Jake froze, his hand hovering just inches from the artifact. The shadows at the edge of the room began to shift, coalescing into a figure draped in black, organic armor. It was Karnathis, the harbinger of the ancient enemy they had awakened. "You think this ritual will save you?" Karnathis sneered, his glowing red eyes locking onto them. "You think a mere bond will stop what is to come?" Jake stepped back, his heart pounding. "Didn't you get enough last time? Or do you just enjoy crashing important moments?" Karnathis ignored him, his focus on Lyra. "Your ancestors' blessing means nothing. The Karnath will rise again, and when we do, no bond, no human, no council will stand in our way." Lyra's expression hardened, and she drew her blade, the blue sheen reflecting the artifact's light. "You underestimate us, Karnathis. The bond isn't just a symbol, It's a promise. And we're stronger than you think. Jake felt the hum of the bond surge through him, Lyra's determination flooding his senses. It was as if her courage had become his own. He stepped forward, surprising even himself. "You talk a big game," Jake said, his voice steady. "But all I see is someone clinging to a past they've already lost." Karnathis's eyes narrowed, his form seeming to darken. Bold words for a mortal tied to a bond he barely understands. "Maybe," Jake replied, glancing at Lyra. "But this mortal has something you'll never have. Someone willing to fight by my side." Without warning, Karnathis lunged, his armor pulsing with dark energy. Lyra moved like lightning, intercepting him with a strike that sent a shockwave through the chamber. The two clashed in a blur of movement, their blades colliding in flashes of light. Jake knew he couldn't just stand by. He turned to the artifact, its glow intensifying, as if urging him forward. He placed his hands on its surface, feeling a surge of warmth flood through him. The voice of the ancestors echoed in his mind, powerful and ancient. "Do you accept the burden of the bond, human? Do you pledge to protect this union, no matter the cost?" Jake didn't hesitate. Yes. The artifact flared with blinding light, and a wave of energy rippled through the chamber. Karnathis staggered, his form flickering as the power of the bond overwhelmed him. Lyra seized the moment, driving him back with a final strike that sent him crashing into the shadows. "You haven't won," Karnathis hissed, his form dissolving. "The Karnath will return." And then he was gone, leaving the chamber eerily quiet. Jake turned to Lyra, his chest heaving. "So, is it over?" Lyra sheathed her blade, her expression softening as she looked at him. "For now. But he's right. The Karnath won't stop. They'll come back." Jake stepped closer, the bond between them humming with a quiet strength. "Then we'll face them. Together." Lyra smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up her face. Together. The artifact's glow dimmed, and the chamber shifted, its energy settling into a calm stillness. As they stepped out into the open air, the stars above seemed brighter, the sky more vibrant. Jake felt a strange sense of peace, despite everything they had been through. For the first time, he truly understood the meaning of the bond. It wasn't just a connection between two people, it was a promise to stand together, to fight for something greater than themselves. And as he stood beside Lyra, the weight of the galaxy on their shoulders, he realized he wouldn't trade it for anything. This was his new reality, his new purpose, his eternal promise.